Hey everybody, and welcome to another fun-filled, happy, joyous topic talking about video. I'm Mike B, and I'm going to rip the band-aid right off. Yes, the title is not just clickbait. The military surplus firearm hobby is dead, and I'm going to explain why and how, and kind of the future. I'm also going to go over the history of the military surplus kind of market and hobbyist community and all that stuff. And then we're going to get into why it's dead, and then we'll go to the future. So that's kind of the layout of this video. I do love history, and I do think it's also extremely relevant to our current situation. So that's why we're going to start with right after the American Civil War in the late 1860s specifically. So during the Civil War, especially in the North, on the Union side, production of firearms went through the roof, astronomically through the roof during the Civil War. After the Civil War, the standing army just, decreased in size way drastically, and all of these leftover weapons, if your military decreases by 80-something%, don't quote me on those numbers, we're just using an example because it happened elsewhere in the future too, but we'll get there. So if your military decreases by 80%, you've got enough weapons to supply, that 80%, but you're going to have to pay to store them and pay somebody to maintain them. What do you do with them? Well, you have a couple options. You can destroy them, which is kind of pointless. It's also going to cost money to destroy them. Or there is another option. You can sell them to civilians the government would take a loss technically on the price that they paid versus the price they can sell them for, but it's not a total loss, and you don't have to pay to destroy them or maintain them. So that's kind of the mentality behind that. That's really what got the surplus market kicked off. It existed beforehand. Military firearms, especially in the United States and the Americas at the time, before we were the United States, military firearms were used by everybody. During the American Revolution, there were mainly military arms used. A lot of civilian arms too, but that's kind of the history. It's in our blood, it's in our DNA as Americans to use military surplus weapons. But after the Civil War is when the real market for that began, and people started realizing that there is that option to surplus these weapons instead of just destroying them or sitting on them and having to pay to maintain them. So that's kind of how it began, and then you fast forward and also another thing is you got a lot of veterans. Those 80% of people that were in the military and no longer are, they're going to be familiar with those rifles or pistols or whatever. They're going to be familiar with those arms, and they're going to use them for hunting, for sport shooting, which became really popular after the American Civil War, etc., etc. So that's the whole purpose behind it too. You get a lot of social benefits, cultural benefits, as well as financial. So we'll fast forward a little bit to the two world wars. After the First World War, this happened again. Every time you have a really major conflict anywhere in the world, you're going to have an overproduction and a surplus of weaponry after that conflict is over, if it is ever over. But even as equipment becomes outdated, it was like, okay, well, again, do we really need to have all of these, after the First World War in the United States specifically, do we need all these Craig Jorgensen rifles sitting here if we're really not going to use them? And all of our National Guard units that did not get 1903s or 1917s, they already have enough, and we've got just sitting here. So Craigs became a really popular thing during and after the First World War. So you fast forward to the Second World War, and the whole idea still stands. You've got people that couldn't afford to buy a commercial firearm that can now afford to buy a surplus firearm. That was the whole thing. That's an issue, though, for a certain group of people, and we'll talk about that. After World War II, it was the same thing. There's this massive influx of surplus firearms. I noticed I didn't mention the National Firearms Act. That didn't impact surplus firearms that much. That targeted certain items and the way people did things and classified things. But for the most part, that really didn't affect surplus. That's why I didn't really want to get into that and waste more time. But I figured I'd bring it up because somebody would if I didn't. So after the Second World War, it's the same thing. You've got this massive influx of Mauser rifles, and then you've got people upgrading every time they upgrade, and then you've got this big transition period in the 50s and 60s where most militaries in the world, Western militaries and most, we'll say, developed militaries, were using semi-automatic self-loading rifles as their main battle rifle, or an assault rifle if you want to call it that. But anyway, bolt-action rifles were quickly becoming obsolete in a short amount of time, and the same concept applied, except this time it was worldwide. We were buying arms from other countries previously, and that was a thing. But after the Second World War, it was, especially during that transition period, it was like, okay, we've got literally billions, I think, of these firearms that need to go somewhere, because again, the same reasons, you can't pay to maintain them. Do you destroy them? It costs so much money. It's a waste. Do you melt them all down? Some of them, who knows? It's also very expensive. The option that was put on the table, and people took advantage of it in the United States and Canada and other places that allowed firearms. You want to talk about an insane amount of really cheap, affordable firearms coming into countries. The 50s, 60s, 70s, you're really looking at a lot. Now, we're going to back up just a little bit because I got ahead of myself talking about the 70s. So this whole thing, when this is in the 60s and you've got all these bolt-action rifles, and you've got all these really cheap surplus pistols. A lot of these were surplus after the First World War, these Ruby pistols. And certain commercial, I won't call out any companies, but certain commercial companies were not happy with this because these were a fraction of the cost, and more people were buying these because they could afford them instead of being able to afford, let's say, Browning, FN, Colt, those kind of firearms. So that started to ruffle some feathers as far as the corporate part of the gun industry. That's going to come into play here in 1968 when you've got the Gun Control Act, which was a kind of a knee-jerk reaction, but it was formulated at the same time. It started really when Kennedy was killed with the Carcano, or it's, again, not going to get into that conspiracy. The official story that everybody believed at the time, or most people believed, was that he was killed with a surplus Carcano Model 9138 with a cheap scope on it. That was the thing, and it was a cheap surplus gun that apparently Lee Harvey Oswald bought because it was cheap, it was affordable, it was a mail order thing, and then Charles Whitman, that whole thing, he was using an M1 carbine that he had purchased and all that stuff. So they were kind of thinking, oh well, these cheap guns combined with the money that we're getting from these big gun companies, these people are saying that their business is hurting because of all these cheap guns coming in, especially pistol manufacturers. Surplus pistols were insanely popular. That's why there's so many of them in the United States as well. And you take something like this, that's mostly everybody can afford, no matter what their social and economic class is, and you put some restrictions on these. That's what you gave the Gun Control Act in 1968. And I got a lot of these, this history from the Fudbusters channel. If you haven't checked Matt out over there, he has a lot of good context as to how surplus has suffered over the years. So that's where a lot of this information from here on out is going to come from. So I'm going to summarize it. He goes into more detail, but I'm just going to go over the overall history. This will be a long video, but I promise you it will be worth it. It will explain a lot. So yeah, Kennedy gets killed. So the Gun Control Act factors in all these things and uses that as an excuse to wrap up. There you have your gun register, or your background checks. You form 4473. You need an FFL to sell guns legally. You can get a collector's license, but you still have to get a license to get guns. You have to go through the background check, blah, 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 blah. That's when it started really going downhill, and it targeted mainly surplus pistols. And again, Matt talks about that in his video. That's when it really started to go downhill. These pistols, because they weren't, what was it, the terminology that they were using? It didn't serve a sporting purpose. So that's where you start hearing that word too getting thrown around, the sporting purposes. Never really targeted shotguns, started to target rifles, specifically automatic and semi-automatic rifles, which will come into play in a little bit. These are all surplus. So you got to remember, before a certain time, you could get fully automatic surplus weapons, and you had to register them, but you could own them, and you didn't need $1 billion to do that, and they were still being manufactured. So you got to take that into consideration. That's part of the surplus history, is the fully automatic. I know it seems like it's really far into the past and a thing of the past, but it was still relevant. So that continues. I'm just going to look at my notes here to stay on track so I don't make this too long. All right, and so that's where you get lobbying really starting to play into the market of military surplus firearms. Now, let's fast forward a few years. The 70s, the war on drugs starts, and in the 1980s, there's all these conflicts with the war on drugs, and the DEA and whatever other alphabet soup agencies that were coming into contact with these cartels and these gangs that were heavily armed with illegal weapons that weren't even from the United States. The cops were saying that they were outgunned and that they needed to do something to prevent them from being outgunned in all these circumstances. So what happened was in 1986, so this is, again, if you want to make this a partisan thing, this is under a very, very conservative Republican administration. The Hughes Amendment is the amendment that made machine guns no longer be able to be produced in the United States, and that was a part, an extension of the Firearm Owners Protection Act in 1986, which you had a certain amount of time to register every machine gun that you had or turn it in. Otherwise, it'd be a whatever felony. This impacted the surplus market because you could no longer really afford to own Class 3, what is now Class 3 surplus firearms. So, and that also was really weird because it didn't really stop any of the crime that was happening with the war on drugs. These cartels and everybody were not necessarily getting weapons from the United States. So that really only impacted people who enjoyed using these weapons for practical purposes, sporting purposes, going out doing shooting competitions, just having fun. I mean, you're allowed to have fun as long as you're safe and not hurting anybody. That's what I think, at least. So that was the beginning of what I think is the end. The Gun Control Act of 1968 really sucked, but maybe that was actually the beginning of the end. Anyway, I'm gonna try to stay relevant. Just work with me here, people. Work with me. I'm sorry, it's very scatterbrained, and I have notes in front of me, so it says a lot about my state of mind. Now, we fast forward a little bit to the early 1990s, right? The late 80s and 90s were a bad time for surplus importation restrictions. Now, this is some of the information that you can go over and look at Matt's video on about why is it so hard to import firearms to the United States. I was unaware of this, but there were agreements made by President H.W. Bush and Clinton with Russia, China, and it basically said, okay, we don't want you importing these cheap AKs and shotguns and whatever the hell else, these non-sporting rifles. We don't want you importing those into the United States anymore because people are getting shot by them. They used a couple cases, to get a knee-jerk reaction. Okay, well, the handshake sealed that deal. There's memorandums written up, as far as I know. And it's been on the books via whatever power the government has. And it just keeps getting added to, but none of those restrictions get taken away. So that's why we can't get stuff from China or Russia directly or any former Soviet satellite country, which is weird unless it's sat in a third-party country. Yeah, anyway, I won't go into that legal part of it, but that's what happened. That is where surplus starts getting constrained as far as supply goes. Demand is still very low because it's consistent. It's been low for a long time. Most people look at this stuff as old junk because of the lobbyists and these gun companies spewing that stigma out, using it as propaganda so they could still make money and they wouldn't have to compete with this other market of actually affordable guns. So that's how that happens. Now, we're going to fast forward. The 1990s to the 2012 time period was fantastic, and I got in at the very tail end of that. It started at about 2003 collecting, but I was very young and didn't have a lot of money. And I'll just explain to you why it was cool in that time. There's two types of surplus hobbyists, right? There's the practical person, the practical shooter who uses it for a practical purpose like hunting or something. It's just viewed it as a tool by them. And it's more affordable than buying a commercial firearm, and they can chop it up, make it lighter. That's why you see a lot of sporterized firearms at a fraction of the cost. Even if you get work done by a gunsmith, you can afford it if you're poor or working class. You don't have to spend 10 times the amount to get a commercial firearm. And that's how a lot of people are. They viewed them as tools. And that's fine. That's what they are. They're tools. And then there's the second type who views them as a tool as well as appreciating the history and enjoying the research. And the practicality is a cool factor too because it's tangible history and you actually can get out and use it in the practical sense. But the majority of the people like myself love the history of it and going in and finding out what all the different markings mean. And it's a lot of fun combined with the fact that you can go out and shoot a bunch of surplus ammo out of a surplus rifle and still not spend as much shooting all of that in one weekend as you would just buying commercial stuff. So that was really fun. The community was rather small because, again, that stigma of surplus guns being just kind of this shit that's going to blow up in your face was perpetuated, and that kept the price down because the demand was low. Now, we're going to fast forward to 2012, and I've talked about this ad nauseum in my videos, but a lot of you are first-time viewers of this video or subscribers to my channel, so we're going to go over it one more time. 2012 was the beginning of the end of the hobby being affordable. Being that community, that small community, they're not really popular. And when you find somebody that's into it with you and loves the history, it's like, oh man, this is amazing. 2012 happens, Sandy Hook happens, the gun control is proposed, all that stuff. I won't go into the details. Basically, people panicked. They bought up all the tactical shit like the ARs, the AKs, the civilian platforms, the semi-auto platforms, FAL, anything tactical or whatever. That's when people started absolutely going shit panicky, and the fear mongering in the gun community started, which I've already made a video on. And what happened was once all the tactical stuff ran out, this whole fear kept being driven, and they're like, a gun is a gun is a gun. And then all of a sudden they start buying these cheap, shitty surplus guns and realize that they're actually not shitty, and they're pretty practical and functional. And they're also really fun. And then they start realizing that there's a historic value, and history is it's like the cool hobby to have, but people get it wrong a lot, and that's really annoying. But anyway, everybody wants to be part of that cool guy hobby, you know? And so people start going, hey, what do I have? What is it? Oh, there's actually history to this $70 Moist Nugget rifle I just picked up. And all of a sudden this culture starts building, but also demand is increasing, and it's increasing. And you've got YouTubers that are getting really popular because of this whole thing, the chain reaction of events. Now, that's a good thing because it increased the community. It's also a bad thing because it increased the community. Again, for the longest time, the surplus kind of community and the people that appreciated these things were really small, very tight-knit, very kind of just laughed at and, you know, pushed to the side by the rest of the gun owners of America. That was good for us. But now it started to get popular. So it was a good thing and a bad thing because people started appreciating these. Less people actually start cutting them up and ruining them, which is cool, but the demand is increasing. And all the while this is going on in 2014, the war in Ukraine starts, or the conflict, whatever the frick you want to call it, and they stop exporting Mosin Nagant 9130s and other weapons. So you've got demand increasing, and you've also got other trade restrictions, these little deals that are being made over the years by every administration. And every administration could have actually just with the stroke of a pen removed these import restrictions, but they don't. They just keep adding to them. So be aware of that. And for all you people that are hardcore Trump fans, he actually signed in 2017, or approved or whatever, agreed to stop importing a certain Russian company's goods. So it's not a partisan thing. It's just a government thing. Remember that. And so anyway, fast forward, the value starts increasing on these. People start asking ridiculous prices. Everybody wants to get in. The fear of missing out kind of happens with this history thing because they're not making them anymore, which is all understandable. That drives prices sky high, and that's understandable because the supply is decreasing, or you know, it's not decreasing, but it's not increasing at the rate that the demand is increasing. So you're going to have higher prices. Now that goes on, it starts cooling down during Trump's administration because everybody thinks that that's fine if the government is your political football team, but nothing really changed. It just kept getting worse. There was more trade restrictions put on, but overall surplus kind of leveled off, and that everything kind of calmed down, the dust settled, and it was okay for the 4 years. Now, 2020 happens, right? So you've got people panicking because of legitimate reasons. You've got the illness, you've got the riots, you've got police not showing up, you've got a lot of new gun owners, and now we're in the same boat. Surplus wasn't as affected last year as just the tactical stuff and ammunition and toilet paper, et cetera, but now I've noticed in the past 6 months, it's kind of the similar situation, but it's more of a slower yet just as intense burn as 2012, and it's lasting a lot longer. Surplus stuff is going so high, I'm actually done buying stuff for a while. I'm done adding to my collection. I'm probably, for a while at least. And that sucks because I do have enough guns to enjoy basically for the rest of my life, but I enjoy trying out every different flavor. That's part of the hobby, right? Last year was the last nail in the coffin for the military surplus firearm hobby. Now, that may sound doom and gloom and all black-pilled, and it kind of is because it sucks seeing something that I really enjoyed and basically based my life and most of my passions based around this get destroyed by human ineptitude. I don't know if that's a word, but it really has. And I already made a video on that. But I'm just saying that's the history of where we're at, how we got here, and why it's been dead as far as being an affordable hobby. Now, there will be military surplus firearms forever. Like, we've got so many in this country right now. They're always going to be here. You're always going to be able to find one. The only problem is that whole affordability factor of the hobby, which was a huge chunk of it, is gone. And that sucks because for somebody that's starting out, I've had a lot of you guys, you younger guys, ask me, should I get into the hobby? And I hate to say it, but at this point, I would say no. Save your money. Get into something that's a little bit more affordable. if you want to, start your collection. Military surplus is not the way to do it unless you've got deeper pockets nowadays. And that's just the sad reality of it. It's a combination of, it's just human ineptitude. It's selfishness, greed, panic, fear, stupidity, ignorance, you name it. It's a bunch of different things wrapped into one that have ruined this hobby, completely destroy what it was. Now the hobby's still going to be there. It's just going to be a very bastardized, kind of more or weird version of what it used to be. It's going to be all about, what is this worth? Oh my God, look at me. I have this. It's so valuable. I'm going to buy this as an investment now. Nobody thought about that 20 years ago, and they're all whining about it in the YouTube comments. Oh, I should have bought a crate of SKSs. Well, you didn't know. Like, you don't have a crystal ball. I don't either. I mean, but my prediction is that unless you are making a lot of money and you have a lot of expendable income, which people don't seem to really have as much of nowadays because of human ineptitude, I honestly say don't get into the hobby. And it's not because I want it all for myself. I've already got more than what I've ever wanted. Because I got in at the very tail end of it being an okay time for military surplus. And I'm not hoarding because I love all these things. I love using them, and I don't have 50,000 of these just sitting here just to sell for $5,000 a piece on Gunbroker someday. Anyway, I know this video is going to be long, but some of you guys really need to hear this because I don't want you to get screwed. There's also a lot of people screwing a lot of new people over because they're selling things that are surplus that aren't worth what they're asking, even in today's market, and they're lying to people, and there's a lot of deceit, a lot more than I've ever seen. So that's another factor. I might make a video on that. So yeah, okay, I think I've covered everything. Sorry, again, this is long-winded, but this is a very important video because this is basically a big chunk of my channel, my personal passion, my life, and it's really sad to see it going this way, but things change. It's a paradigm shift in more than one way, and the military surplus hobby is one of those things affected. Anyway, if you made it this far, which I know most of you will because you guys are awesome, comment with Ruby. I made it this far. It was a nice little pistol. I'll be making videos on this year. Don't worry. So, all that being said, if you are one of those people that are really cool and you want to become a sponsor of this video and all my other content, you can do so by becoming a Patreon supporter or a channel member. And for $5 a month or more on either platform, you get access to my Discord server, which is really fun. There's a lot of people on there. It's a lot more people than I ever thought were going to be on there, and it's so cool because crowdfunding has been allowing me to do a lot of cool content that I wouldn't be able to afford just funding out of pocket. It's really been a great year for that for me, and this year is going to be even better. I've got some really cool stuff that I use Patreon money to get that I'm making some bomb content with. Trust me, it's going to be awesome. Doing some collabs with other channels and stuff like that. Doing some really cool things that, again, would not be affordable for me just funding out of pocket. So if you want to do that, that would be great. You know where to click. If you can't support the channel financially and you still want to support my work and you like what I do, you can still support me by liking this video, giving it a thumbs up like the YouTube algorithm likes. Subscribing to my channel if you haven't already, and you can just share this video. That's the best way to actually get the word out. If you like this video, if you agree with it, if you disagree with it, if you think somebody needs to hear it, all that stuff. It just starts up a conversation. You don't really technically have to pay for this, and it's still firearm, military surplus firearm related. So maybe that's the future of the hobby. Who knows? Anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you don't want to support me, I hate to say it, but you already have just by watching. So thanks again, everybody. I really appreciate it. And we'll see you on the next video.